Hello. On behalf of Beacon House School System, the organizer of this conference, I'd like to welcome you to the final session of the 12th edition of SOT, A School of Tomorrow from Darkness to Light. The School of Tomorrow event series was launched by Beacon House in the year 2000 to engage in conversations with local and global audiences and help inform the direction of the organization, the schools, and the society at large. My name is Ali Ahmed Khan, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Beacon House, Pakistan. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of our second fully virtual SOT event. Thank you for joining me on this panel, Post-COVID Educational Landscapes, Transformation or Reformation. Let me introduce you to the panel of esteemed professionals I have with me. Professor Maggie Atkinson, educator and strategic leader in schools and government. She was the Children's Commissioner for England from 2010 to 2015. She's an honorary professor at Keele University and a reflective commentator on the world in which we raise, care for, nurture, educate, and value our children. Dr. Maryam Churtai is the assistant professor at Lum School of Education. She has a doctorate and 2 master's degrees from Harvard University, specializing in education policy and leadership practice. She's also the director, Pakistan programs for the Harvard Mithil South Asia Institute. Mr. Jude Heaton is the director of Global Learning Lab, Teach for All Malaysia. He's a graduate of the University of Nottingham with a degree in philosophy. He has also worked in the British Deputy Prime Minister's Research and Analysis Unit with a focus on social mobility and served as the lead advisor on higher education. And our fourth participant who hasn't joined us yet, Honorable Minister Mr. Taimur Khan Jhagra, is the Minister for Finance, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan. He holds an MBA from London Business School and a degree in mechanical engineering from GIK. He's a former McKinsey partner and worked at the firm for over 9 years in the UAE. I hope he can join us soon. Thank you all for joining me on this panel. A little introduction on the topic at hand. The COVID-19 pandemic has held an unknown card to the global education sector, bringing forth a multitude of challenges while also unleashing new ways of learning and teaching, many of which were not readily embraced before. Several models of teaching are being tried and tested with mixed results. In these difficult times, the world needs to make rapid decisions and adjust at lightning speed to ensure that new ways of learning, particularly those in the virtual space, are in fact delivering expected results. And if so, that the digital divide between learners is minimized while competency and skill development are stressed. Following this pandemic, education needs to change profoundly. But in what ways? There are no ready-made solutions, technological or otherwise. We must build narratives for what the new reality could look like, and we have to nurture the sources that give us hope for this new world. Before we delve deeper into our topic, I would request our viewers to share their comments and questions using Facebook, YouTube, or SOT website, whichever platform you may be watching us on throughout this session. I will put them to our panelists in about 30 minutes. Let's begin. To be honest, the transformation or reformation discussion is not new. In his book, The Element, Sir Ken Robinson argued that education does not need to be reformed, it needs to be transformed. And in some ways, it has transformed since that book was published in 2009. But there is a long way to go. Maggie, in your opinion, has the COVID crisis hastened the need for a full-on transformation, or do we still need to stick to incremental changes?
In my view, whichever of those two paths we end up choosing, and remember how exhausted teachers are, so radical transformation may not actually be within their energy. But whichever of the two paths we choose, I'm with Chughtai when he says, you need to understand what education is for before you can either reform it or transform it. In this country, in the UK, people are heartily sick of the tweaks and bits and pieces approach that is about reform. Heads, even during the pandemic, have been getting things every 24 hours, sometimes late in the evening, for implementation the next day. And if that's what reform looks like, which is what we've experienced since the start of the national curriculum in 1989, then let's have enough of it. We've never stopped to ask ourselves, what are we here to do? Why is important? Why is education so important? Transformation is much more radical and sometimes can be wished for. It's a bit like metamorphosis. You know, you turn a bug into a butterfly. But you can also attempt to turn a society like South Africa, for example, into an egalitarian wonderland, and look where we've been since Mandela started that. Great hopes, great transformation, supposedly backed by people that wanted change and freedom. And we are still struggling in the backwaters of continued prejudice, continued inequality, continued loss and loneliness and sadness and violence. And if we're going to transform education, the very first question we need to ask everybody, learners included, and parents and commerce, as well as teachers, is what are we here for? What's our element? To quote Ken, whom I knew, what is the reason we get out of bed in the morning to do what we do? And then if you want transformation, it will come much more solidly and much more quickly, because people have bought the philosophy before they buy the structures and the papers and the policies and the laws. Why are we here? What's this about? Has to be our foundation question. And COVID gives us that opportunity, it seems to me. Horrible as it is, tragic as it is, sad and desolate as it can be for so many families, our opportunity is that we can sit back now and ask why.
Thank you. Mariam, could you help us understand what this transformation would look like if it was to happen?
Thank you, Ali. I think that the pandemic has really pushed us into a change that was much delayed already in education. I think that what it would very functionally look like is that a lot of educators who have relied on traditional ways of doing business need to become entrepreneurs. Nobody knows how a child learns better than a teacher. Nobody understands the mechanics of education better than an education administrator. And I think this is an idea whose time has come. I think that functionally, this is a moment of opportunity for a lot of educators, no matter which level you operate at, to discover the internet as you did for the first time. I think most people in our age group remember the moment when they first made their email address. And as delayed as that is in education, this is the moment where education has discovered the internet in many ways. And I would encourage all people who are part of the education ecosystem to consider entrepreneurial opportunities to move and utilize this window that has opened up.
Very nicely put. I think it is the discovery of internet by education. Jude, how are you reimagining education in your line of work?
Thank you, Ali. I think a few areas I'd maybe draw attention to. The first is maybe a question of well-being and putting the well-being of students at the heart of what we do. When the pandemic started, many of the teachers who I work with, their first priority was, how do I get my lessons to children now? And very quickly, they started realizing that that wasn't the primary question that they were facing. If they were working in communities where some of the children were struggling to get access to meals, were struggling to get access to a safe home, were dealing with acute amounts of stress and anxiety as maybe family members were sick or were out of work. These questions, these fundamental questions of child well-being, were forced into the foreground of many of our teachers' attention. Now, those questions are not new questions, but in our traditional schooling systems, they've often been enabled to be masked, and the children who are most vulnerable in the system don't get the sort of attention that we might perhaps want. And so one of my hopes for this moment is that this question of child well-being absolutely should come first, not just from a sort of humanitarian and ethical point of view, but also from a learning point of view. The science of learning and brain development is very clear about this, that learning, in particular sort of higher order learning that many of us want to see in the world today, simply isn't possible if children don't have a sense of safety, security, and don't build deep, caring relationships with others. So my first hope is really that well-being stays at the center of our attention, and these questions of vulnerability are not second-order questions, but they're absolutely primary. A second theme I'll draw out is breaking education out of the silo of the classroom, if you like. The idea that schools were the only place where education takes place was always an illusion. Education is absolutely about a wider community effort. And again, in the last few months, many of our educators have been forced to confront that in many, many complex and difficult ways. And what I hope that can bring to our attention is how do we have this broader perspective on education and truly see it as a community responsibility and not put it all at the doors of our teachers, who, as Maggie very eloquently put, there's already so many expectations for our teachers. And to expect our teachers to do all of this on their own is simply not realistic, and is also, frankly, a dereliction of our collective responsibility. One final point I'll add to this is that, to me, also raises a question about the nature of leadership that we see as necessary in education. And for many of the people who I work with around the world, the idea of collective leadership is becoming more and more central. The idea that we can't expect teachers as a lone hero to go in and solve problems. We need to see ourselves as part of a collective working for children's well-being. And where I'll finish is coming back to Maggie's point that I think is absolutely central in all of this, is this moment has raised this question of what is education for? What is the purpose of education? As so many different forces and elements of our society are being disrupted, we're being really forced to confront this question of purpose. And what I hope is that we can stay not just with some of the more energetic and fast-paced moves that we're making now, but really take this moment to slow down and say, what is this for? And have a collective conversation with parents, children, policymakers, community members, to really ground ourselves on a sense of purpose, which I hope can be based on a desire for equity and well-being for students and all of us.
Thank you, Jude. I have a question about well-being, which I'll be putting to the panel, but thank you for sharing your thoughts now. Taimur, I'm glad you could join us. I have a few questions regarding public policy, which I think you'll be able to answer. So if a transformation of education is to happen, how will developing countries like Pakistan will redirect their resources for it?
Look, I think the most important thing, if a transformation of education is to happen, in particular in developing countries, and in particular in state-sponsored systems, and in the light of the COVID pandemic and the challenge and the opportunity that it presents, I think what is incredibly important is that the nature of the transformation and the support that's provided to actually drive it is given by the private sector, and not just in the corridors of policy making of government themselves. And I'll tell you why I feel that is very strongly the case. Because if you segment the kids, for example, in my province in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there's almost 3 different segments that I would think of. And the discussion that we've been having doesn't relate in the same way to all of them. So for the elite few, for the top, say, 10% who study in elite private schools, I think the opportunities that we're talking about, or in the way that we're talking about, absolutely stand true. And they're able to transform the way that they deliver learning to much more of a technology base, basically simply shifting the classroom to a home environment. That is not true of the other 2 segments. The low-cost private schools, where about 50% of kids in a country like Pakistan go, or the state schools, where many of the other poorer kids go and study. If a transformation is to happen there, then indeed I believe that technology still has to be the answer, But these are schools where not always internet is available, or kids who don't always have a tablet at home. And that's where we need the innovation of the private sector to be able to both grasp the opportunity of reimagining education, but reimagining it for these kids. The one other point that I want to make on resources for that transformation. I work in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa as the finance minister, and I've worked on education reform for the decade before I joined politics. And what was very striking was that indeed we need to make more resources available for education. But what is certainly true in a country like Pakistan, and something that we're trying to actually grapple with, is to get more bang for the buck for the money that we spend. Because education is never going to be the only area where additional funding is required. That is going to hold true of healthcare, that is going to hold true of improving public infrastructure that drives economic growth, and so on. So what is also an incredibly important challenge that government, the education system, and the private sector need to solve together in grasping this opportunity is that we're able to devise models where we get greater return on investment for the money that we spend. And I think I'd like to leave on the point of saying what I mean is that the challenge that this government is trying to solve is the fact that where of the 50 million kids who go to school in Pakistan, approximately half of them, when they end primary school, aren't really literate in the sense that they can actually do the grade 5 curriculum in the way that they should be able to. And if we're to solve that, we need to reimagine education in more ways than one.
Very true. I think some of the projects, the public-private partnership projects have been successful, and we need to look more into that if we are to make a transformation. To make online learning more effective, there needs to be a focus on learner agency. Organizations like IB, OECD, and many other national bodies across the world are already working on enhancing learner agency. Mariam, how can schools do that in an online context?
I would like to challenge the predominant perception that this transition to a technology-based learning ecosystem has to be expensive. There has been a lot of investment in education infrastructure, all the way from handing out laptops. At least 10 years ago, when I was a graduate student, the one laptop per child policy was examined by MIT in a multi-country study, and they found that, in fact, learning outcomes for children went down. But in many countries, because giving out technology is easier to do, and it is capital intensive, not to challenge everybody's intentions here, but I think that boat has sailed. We do understand that ed tech solutions do not necessarily have to be expensive. In fact, quite to the contrary, I think ed tech is going to be very economical. There is a saying that right now, rich kids have tablets and poor kids have teachers. And in the future, poor kids will have tablets and rich kids will have teachers. What that means is that you cannot replace with technology what a good teacher can accomplish in person. Now, what I'm trying to say is that with education and with the effective use of technology, you can actually access learning outcomes that were previously just not imaginable, and they don't have to be expensive. I think that, in fact, we should be imagining things like classrooms that have rich and poor kids both in those classrooms. I think that's the kind of education that we should be giving to our society, which around the world has become more and more siloed between rich people and poor people. So I think that it is quite possible to have a limited expenditure on technology and still have very high learning outcomes. And this government in particular, the credit goes to them. As a colleague in education recently said very nicely, that the education in the face the the education ministry, the federal ministry, pretty much acted like a startup, which is very governments or bureaucracies in general, because they were very open to innovation, experiment, and they partnered with edtech companies to bring education to rural parts of Pakistan.
Yeah. I think it's a very valid point you made about this, the cost of education, and I think scalability in technology models sometimes is easier and cheaper than traditional models. But Maggie, would you like to comment on the learner agency with technology?
It's interesting listening to the accounts of what's happening in the system in Pakistan. In England, and I can only speak for England out of the 4 nations of the UK, we are in a fragmenting setup in terms of education. So where the innovation is happening is school by school and federation of schools by federation of schools. It certainly is not happening from the centre, where we have mixed messages so deep you have to wade through them, and where there is an insistence on a curriculum where English, which is my subject, is only English if the author was born before the 19th century and was male and white. And so we go. Mathematics is only mathematics if it's a traditional model rather than qualitative studies or statistical studies. Science is only science if you can split it into physics, chemistry, and biology, and so on ad infinitum. There is a sense here of looking backwards rather than looking forwards. And into that space has stepped a very creative educational community, including academics who write fantastic pieces of research that back innovation. But if you're looking for innovation from the centre, you can go home and have a rest, because it isn't going to happen. What I find in localities is an incredibly responsive system, which has moved during the pandemic into blended approaches to learning, into supporting children who don't have access to the net. And here it's just awful if you're poor. It's not affordable and you can't do it, and you won't have a quiet place to study. So schools have done hard copy versions of packs of materials. They've done study clubs. They're doing the sorts of things that you would expect schools acting as community hubs to do, as well as fantastic lessons online and all of those things that go with that if you do have access to the net. My concern about the end of COVID-19 and our moving into the next phase of education is that if we're not absolutely on this, what both the minister and the professor have just described in terms of inequality and fragmentation of society will be worsened even in supposedly highly developed Western nations. The poor will simply fall to the bottom. And that's my concern. Because if you're already affluent, you've got the latest Samsung folding phone. It's in your back pocket already. Now, those are the issues for us to grapple with as we reform or transform education in the coming decades.
Yeah, digital divide is a genuine problem which exists across the world, and obviously in the poorer countries, it's bigger. So Jude just talked about emotional well-being, and we have had a lot of discussion about learning losses on other panels, and generally you read up about this COVID generation, which could have a lot of gaps in their learning because of the time off and the way the exams have been structured. But from a well-being point of view, Maggie, drawing on your experience as the Children's Commissioner in the UK, how can schools contribute to the emotional well-being online?
That's the question of the century, isn't it? I think you have to bring in the parent or carer as your ally in this, if you're a school. They have to be alongside their young person who's the student here. And everybody has to be brought into a place where, as Jude said earlier, we are conscious of children who are well balanced and well supported being readier to learn than children who feel isolated or upset or anxious about what's happening in school or what they're going to face when they go back. if we don't get this right, and isn't it great that this conference is taking place on the weekend of the Day of the Child? The United Nations Day of the Child was on Friday. And every nation apart from the US has signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that children have a right to be nurtured, supported, not just educated in traditional subjects, but educated to be citizens. And that's a joint endeavour. I couldn't agree more with what Jude said in his opening comments. This is a joint endeavour. Schools cannot do this on their own. And even very successful chains of schools like Beacon House cannot do this on their own. This is everybody. This is medics and nurses and parents and the guys who run the corner shop and the guys who run the youth service and the football team. This is everybody. Children need to know that they can talk to somebody.
Yeah. Mariam, the concept of student emotional well-being is rather new in Pakistan. Do you think the online learning platforms provide us with an opportunity to refocus and leapfrog onto this movement?
That's an excellent question, because I think the problem with EdTech has been that we've just been trying to digitize the way the industrial model of education has been delivered. So whatever the school is, we are just trying to digitize that. Whereas what we need to do is take one step forward to educational psychology and thinking about how do kids learn and move back to that source and digitize and introduce technology at that level. Because otherwise you're just overburdening children to not just learn the content that they are learning in a classic industrial model. Everybody learns the same lesson at the same time, irrespective of individual learning preferences or capabilities. But you're also, over and above that, adding the pressure on the parents, the teachers, and the child to adapt to it technologically as well. So I think the answer to making sure that this is not overwhelming for the teacher or the child or the parent is to go back to understanding how kids learn rather than pushing them through this artificial system.
Thank you. Taimur, your thoughts on addressing the emotional well-being from a legislative or from a government point of view?
I think it's one of many balls that you need to juggle with. I think what is definitely true is that in the times of COVID, the closure of schools, which is a question that we're grappling with exactly as we speak, has a huge impact, amongst other things, on the emotional well-being or mental health. I'd say not just of kids, but of society as a whole. I'm not sure the first step at this point that will actually make the greatest impact is legislation. I think, as with many other questions in COVID, we've got to actually find a way of having interventions that actually reach a large scale of people. And in particular, if we have to go for a second round of school closure. Look, the one thing that I want to keep on stressing again and again is I think we're all agreed that technology or EdTech is definitely going to be a key part of the answers to reimagining education. I think we'll all also agree, and I think Dr. Maryam Churtai, I love the quote that she just said about how in the long run, it's going to be the poorer that's going to use technology because having a teacher in person is actually going to be the more expensive proposition. But the challenge today, I think, is to find mechanisms where that technology, whether it is for learning or for emotional well-being, how it can reach village after village or community after community in an effective way. It's not that the technological base is not there. I think if you look at data in Pakistan, you'll find that smartphone penetration is somewhere between 30 and 40%. That's not an insignificant number at all. But I'd say when we start thinking of the EdTech market, it's still driven to perform in the sort of industrial education space that Dr. Chughtai talked about, or assuming that everyone has access to technology at home, at which point it's the marginalized kids who actually get left behind once again. And so the challenge that we will need to meet again and again. And by the way, Ali, I was talking to your chairman yesterday, and he was also talking about how, whereas the top end of Beacon House schools are seamlessly using technology, the lower end educators chain is struggling on how to use it because of parents' access. I don't think that's impossible at all. But I think together the public and private sector need to find solutions where, for the segment of society where the prevalence of technology is there but is spottier than the upper echelons of society, our edtech solutions also work.
Yes, that's true. That leads me to my next question, that some schools in Pakistan were able to continue online the teaching and learning, but a large majority of the country could not benefit from the same because of lack of infrastructure or facilities. I think Talim Ghar and Tele Schools were two very good initiatives which were taken by the government. Now, do you see, Taimur, that the same initiatives playing a role in the post-COVID world?
I think COVID has cracked open the space where we can actually reimagine education. I don't think the model where government keeps on building grey structures, hiring teachers that you can't fire. You know that across the 4 provinces, we've got 1 million teachers hired in this school. So whatever their capacity is, the level of learning that students in public schools are going to be exposed to, because as you know, governments the world over find it very difficult to hire and fire people that actually work in the public sector, meaning that transformative initiatives in the traditional space are going to be very, very slow. So I think it is absolutely incredibly important to still use the time that we are passing through COVID to continue to really focus on how the technological space and discoveries that we're making today will work in the post-COVID era. But I keep on stressing that the focus that we need to have, and that we need the private sector to also have, is to develop these interventions for the many. So just food for thought. Why couldn't we imagine interventions where, say, the technology could be in the hand of teachers who, let's say, during a lockdown, are able to take it to smaller clusters of kids in the community because it's too risky to get 500, 600, 1,000 kids in school every day, right? We know that 30 to 40% of parents or homes are going to have access to technology. And so how can we reimagine and configure edtech solutions that actually reach a large proportion of homes where they won't have access to lessons on TV or access to YouTube at home? And I think we're almost there.
Yeah.
But I think that it is almost natural that we start off by focusing on solutions for the top end of kids, or then still assume that we're devising solutions for kids where we assume that every home has access to technology.
Yes, but I mean, you said we have 1 million teachers, but we also have about 20 million children out of school. So I guess these initiatives could help fill that gap. So Mariam, as a policy research, what kind of recommendations would you give to the government on initiatives like tele schools or Talim Ghar? Are you there? I think we have...
Internet is dropping. Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, I said as a policy researcher, what kind of recommendations would you give to the government for initiatives like Talim Ghar and Teleschool in a post-COVID world? Okay. Okay, so shall I come back to that question? Because I think it'll be good because of your experience in policy. I've just pasted the question, so maybe you can read it off that, and it may be easier to prepare a response. We'll come back to that in a minute. So there's, like any transformation, there are a lot of unknowns. And as we move to technology, there are some risks which coming out of this. And the risks are about security, privacy, and the safety issue of digital platforms. I know we all rushed to be on them, and we didn't think too much about it. I had a lot of teachers when we had issues related to not being able to control class or unauthorized people entering classes. These were issues which were constantly coming up. Now, Maggie, we've heard a lot about privacy issues created by the contact tracing app in the UK. Does the online learning thing brings the same kind of concerns, or is there something being done to address that?
I think schools are rightly concerned about making sure that their children are safe, as are families. What we find here is that in the best learning environments, because schools are very heavily firewalled, because they didn't fall into the trap of using Zoom, so my grandchild does most of his homework on Teams, which is properly firewall protected and has Norton security and other security mechanisms built around it. I think his parents feel really quite safe and secure that when he's at home and learning, he's in a safe environment. Schools work desperately hard, as do academy trusts and chains and federations, as do local authorities, to ensure safety. But the other thing that we do a great deal of here is we work particularly with the charitable sector on educating children to safeguard themselves in the online environment, whether it's for school or with their friends on Snapchat or TikTok or wherever else they're doing. And we tend to do things like a bit kind of folklore, really. If you wouldn't sit at the meal table with your grandma and say that or share that, then why are you doing it online with strangers? It's that sort of speak at the level of the child, speak at the level of the family. Don't let your child sit somewhere where you can't see the screen they're looking at. You are also co-responsible with your school for keeping your child safe. We're in that space that's part of the preparatory questions that we were all asked to look at, really, which is what's the partnership here? And yes, the internet providers and organizations like Google and Facebook and YouTube and others have a massive responsibility that we can't let them slide away from to help us to keep our children safe. So it's a collective. We're back to the collective that Jude was talking about earlier. But I think as your global learning lab person, he may well also have some very useful things to say. So I'll stop now.
Thank you. Jude, your thoughts on privacy and how you're handling it in Malaysia and across the global learning lab countries?
I suppose before going too much into the details on what to do on privacy, I suppose I just want to slightly push back on this idea that reimagining and rethinking education is primarily a question of technology. And the reason why I say that is I think we need to be clear about the difference between the tools and the means that we use for education and the vision and outcomes which we're aiming for in education. So one of the interesting things that we're noticing actually in the global network that I work alongside is that some of the most interesting areas of innovation are not happening in the high income areas, they're happening in the low income areas. And one of the reasons for that is in the high income areas, as we've already heard on this call from a couple of different perspectives, one of the things that's been able to happen is just replicating what was happening already, except on a virtual platform. Whereas in some of the lower economic contexts, there was this push to really rethink what are we trying to do and how do we do that here. And so, for example, in terms of how technology can work in those ways, we're seeing, for example, you might not need a mobile phone in every household, but if one person in a neighborhood has access to WhatsApp, then a teacher can provide materials in a low bandwidth context that can be shared in that way. And in those sorts of contexts, there really aren't so many privacy concerns that come up in quite the same way. There are community care questions that do come up, but those, to Maggie's point, really helps just sort of align with questions that we might have on a day-to-day basis. Where do I feel safe my child going? Is this a safe environment? What kind of oversight is there? And so on. In terms of sort of some of the technical sides of privacy, I mean, yes, I think there are questions, particularly if we continue in online platforms for sustained periods of time. There are questions of what sort of data is being gathered from that, who has access to that data, and what ways can that data be monetized. And that raises all kinds of broader political and social questions that we might want to worry about. And I think, as we've seen with many technology platforms, often we start by opening the doors and then standards get set in place that have quite deep roots and are then very difficult to change. So I think we need to be going in with our eyes open at this early stage, that we're not setting in place practices, traditions that allow forms of exploitation in the longer term.
Mariam, I think you probably missed the last part of the start of the question. This is related to safety, security of the digital platforms. And I'm sure you're aware that because we have jumped on this bandwagon, there are some official channels, and then there are unofficial channels like WhatsApp and Messenger, which get used by schools to communicate, or teachers with their students. So what advice would you give schools to help protect their children?
I think that if you go back to the moment when we all were faced with the question that should we shut down our school, university, organization, and or not, this is around March. I was in a similar meeting at my institution, and I was trying to convince them that nature is really indifferent. The universe is indifferent. The pandemic is indifferent to whether we want to make this shift or not, because this shift is happening. The question is, come fall 2020, do you want to be prepared to run the university online, or do you want to be caught off guard and run the university online? And I'm very happy that I represent an institution that had the foresight to decide to go online in March for fall. I think that a similar theme applies to the question of privacy. This is not something we can avoid. Children already have access to the internet. There is a lot of exploitation of content related to children. It is something that we have to embrace and tackle head on, rather than live in the illusion that this is something that if we avoid this shift to online and technology-based instruction, somehow we can avoid exploitation of children.
I guess we can, but Taimur, although there are cybercrime laws, but is this an issue which gets discussed at the government level, and are they trying to legislate for that, so it becomes in the focus for just schools as well as students?
I think the core legislation is already in place, but I think very honestly we're grappling with more basic issues of learning, of functioning of schools, of at this very moment the risk presented with the continued opening of schools versus the opportunity cost of the closure of the school system. So I honestly think that it's not necessarily, although I think it's a very important debate, but I don't think it's one that is or ought to be at the top of the government agenda in a place like Pakistan, as far as education priorities are concerned. I also think that in the context of the learning environment for the many, as Jude said, the very simple use of technology, for example, the dissemination of lessons through WhatsApp or so, make it less of a concern at this particular moment.
Great. Mariam, the question which because of the internet you couldn't respond to was related to any recommendations you can make as a policy researcher to the government about these initiatives like Teleschool and Talim Ghar, how to continue with them in a post-COVID world.
I would emphasize the collaboration between research, policy, and practice. For too long, these three silos have worked independently, and we have been doing bad interventions at scale, good interventions at very small scale, and researchers are very comfortable just publishing in peer-reviewed journals, which 95% of the people that they are hoping to impact can't even access. My recommendation to the government would be that as we are entering this very big moment of opportunity for a transformation in education, that they must take education researchers along. And it is only through research that we will be able to understand what works and what does not work. And sometimes that may mean that solutions that are very comfortable, may mean very quick political successes, are not good for children. The system was broken before the pandemic, by the way. The statistic that Taimur was just highlighting was that a majority of our kids at 5th grade have the learning, the English and mathematics competency of 2nd grade. That is also true in India. So the system was broken, and one reason it's broken is because researchers, policymakers, and practitioners do not talk to one another. So my recommendation to the government would be to operate at that nexus and hold on to that nexus in whatever intervention they make.
Thank you. That's a very pertinent suggestion. While we're talking about students here, there's an important stakeholder which needs to be mentioned, the parent. And many teachers at my school have also talked about increased pressure on students because parents are now in the classroom. We frequently see parents sitting with their children while they attend classes. So this has brought about a new paradigm. Now, Jude, how are parents responding in your part of the world?
So my role at the moment involves really working with organizations right across the world. So we work with partners in 60 different countries, and it looks very different from place to place. I'd say one of the patterns that we're seeing is this greater awareness of the rooting of education in the community. And I think in many ways, I think this is a very positive thing, is, and at the heart of what we see in some of the most transformational classrooms is a start by really questioning the purpose of education, and that questioning being rooted in a conversation with parents, and parents working alongside teachers and students. Now, I think there's a real question as to whether one of the tensions that arises is to what extent parents have been part of that conversation or not. And if they haven't been part of that conversation in the past, and then through the disruptions of the COVID time, are sort of pushed into a role which the school hasn't engaged with them before, then sometimes issues can occur in terms of forms of anxiety and stress and uncertainty. But one of the most powerful things we're seeing is places where teachers are really taking this opportunity to work alongside parents and to, come up with sort of holistic solutions for what's going to most work for children, because parents obviously know their children so well and care about their children. And if there can be that sense of partnership, and a real sense of collective effort, then we're seeing some really inspiring examples of how education is shifting in all sorts of very diverse contexts. And again, I'd really stress this is not about a more developed or less developed context. We're seeing some really inspiring examples in the UK, in New Zealand, in rural areas of Nepal, in rural areas of Pakistan. This sort of, in a way, it helps us connect with one of those sort of fundamental points of education, some of these basic humane elements of education, and connects us with some of its core purposes, which can be really inspiring and good to see.
I agree. Where we have that partnership, it's very successful. But Mariam, I'm sure you have come across a lot of questions about online learning in Pakistan. So how do we make that transformation happen when parents are stuck in their own school experience and can't really see the value of this online learning?
I think that just as the corporate sector has evolved, the real estate market has had to really adjust, because a lot of companies are no longer interested in paying rent when most of their employees could work from home. I think similarly, in the transformation of how education is delivered, we have to understand that education will no longer be something that parents can just outsource to the teachers and to the schools. It is something in which the parent, the teacher, the administrator, and the student will have to be equal stakeholders. And the mechanism through which education is delivered needs to be friendly to a working parent's reality. A teacher who has to teach and spend so much time with multiple kids in a totally new kind of a platform. So again, we cannot just dump the responsibility of the adjustment on, teachers need to adjust, and parents and students need to adjust, and parents need to adjust until they need to. I think that the whole landscape of how education is delivered has to be reimagined. And parents have to play their part, and employers have to allow parents to play their part. There is no other way to move forward.
Taimur, can the government do anything to build parental confidence into online education and change their attitudes?
I think here absolutely can, is, and will continue to do so. I think the engagement of parents is important and in the interest of government, because I think it also builds a layer of accountability and connectivity between parents and government schools. So I think it is an absolutely essential area where we should and do encourage parents to act sensibly in this role. And the reason that we can actually engage on this is that in this case, having that large workforce gives you the means to communicate as well in every community.
Thank you. Maggie, in your experience, how slow or fast do these attitudes change?
The more you can involve parents and carers, and remember, some children are not with their parents, they're with foster carers, or they're adopted, or they're with granddad or whatever, the more quickly they will adjust to what schooling is really about, rather than what they imagine it's about because of their own school experience. So the fact that parents are hovering in the background when their children are engaged in classes is actually no bad thing, as far as I'm concerned. And where is the use by schools of the strengths and skills and amazing competencies that many, many parents also have? Are you, for instance, getting the parent who speaks 3 languages to be involved in their children's exploration of both their home tongue and the mother tongues of other nations as part of the rounded curriculum that all contributors this afternoon have been speaking about? If this is a joined endeavour, not an outsourced one, to quote Mariam, then actually it's a joined endeavour where you're using the skills of parents as co-educators. They are their children's first educators, after all. You learn to walk and talk, you learn to handle food, you learn to handle hygiene and dressing yourself at home, not at school. And therefore, home is also a learning environment. How are we best placed to use what parents bring into this environment alongside their children? And COVID has presented the most amazing opportunities to capitalize on that. And we should be using it. We should be using it.
I hope we are. Thank you very much. Now we have 7 minutes left, or 6 minutes. So I'm going to go to the question and answers, which will be shared on the panelists. We should be able to see that on their screen. Just let me see. Okay. I'm going to, yeah. Okay, I don't think, can we see the questions, please? Okay. All right. The first question is how private and public sector can join hands to bring the Reformation, this Amin Khan. Who should we, maybe Dr. Mariam, could you take this one, please? Because Taimur has already commented on this.
I think
yes.
I think Minister Jhagra is in a much better position to speak to this with experience, because the way KPK has managed the response to the coronavirus pandemic is really commendable. And I think one thing that they did differently was that they, as the public sector, really embraced the private sector. And they did not look at it as a competition, but rather looked at it as a way for providing better service at scale, which was affordable. The private sector does not have a major incentive to work with the government sector because they are doing what they're doing just fine. The onus is on the public sector, on the government, to make it more easy for the private sector to come in and not face bureaucratic hurdles. And there is nobody better positioned to do that than the government of KPK, which has already demonstrated this in the context of the health sector in the pandemic.
Minister Jhagra, would you like to add something?
I mean, I fully agree. I'll just give an example from the health sector where I'm playing a leading role in terms of the responsibility that I have. Is government's job is to enable the private sector to participate and become a partner. We did that over the last few months by designing our universal health insurance scheme, which means that between November 1 and January 31st, in a period of just 90 days, 40 million people, the entire province, is going to get substantial health insurance. And I think that will open up the health market to the private sector to help build and augment government capacity in a way that will not happen in any other place in Pakistan. I think we simply need to structure the same scaffolding for education so that the private sector's attention is drawn to be able to helping us. And I think similar interventions will flow.
It's wonderful to hear that. This question is for Dr. Maryam Churtai. Just let me, it says, with so much happening in the education space and the need to respond quickly to the changing landscape, isn't all the talk of single national curriculum an untimely distraction or even an unnecessary one? Amara Khalid, it had to come up. Yes, when you were on the panel.
No, I appreciate the question. In fact, as we were working on grades 6 to 8 now, all the criticism that had come towards people who were involved in the curriculum for 1st to 5th grade stayed with us and held us more accountable to be even more serious about what we were doing. It's very heartening to see that so many people care about this issue. The question itself, I think, it's best answered by saying that quality learning will always be in fashion. You know, quality learning will always be in demand. There is never a bad time to focus on improving education. And in the face of the pandemic, it becomes, I don't think, it should not go to the sidelines. In fact, revamping what student learning outcomes our students should be focusing on should become front and center. I think this is a time for us to, much like in our homes, when we find out that someone is.
Oh. I think we lost Dr. Mariam once again. We have a few more questions, but that's all we have time for. Anyway, I would like to thank my esteemed panelists, Dr. Maryam Churtai, Professor Maggie Atkinson, Honorable Minister Mr. Taimur Jhagra, and Mr. Jude Heaton for their time and valuable input on these important topics. I'd also like to thank Ms. Saima Bakar for being a great session manager. She has been coordinating with us for the last few days on this. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in and sharing their comments and questions. I'm sorry if we could not take your question, but we will keep the conversation alive on the SOT website. Please visit our website, www.sotevents.com, to catch up on the sessions of these 3 days. On behalf of the chair of SOT, Mr. Qasim Kasuri, I'd like to thank all the participants of the conference. We look forward to seeing you in person and online for the 13th edition of the SOT next year. Fingers crossed. From me, Ali Ahmed Khan, and the SOT team, good night and God bless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very well chaired. Very well chaired.